Hello and welcome back to the Start a Glamping Business podcast. We've got a repeat guest for you today. It's Nick Labadie. He was actually our first guest when we did the rebrand to the sort of US focus podcast rather than the UK glamping side of things. We had a really good episode with him. It was probably about, 6, 7, 8, 9 months ago now. Where we talked all about the zoning system and how it's the first thing you should check when either you have an existing property or you're looking to buy a property for a glamping business. We're going to dive a little bit deeper into that today, but also some various other issues when you're looking to buy a property for a glamping business. We're going to be talking all about red flags when purchasing a property, because there are plenty of green flags that you should be looking for, and there are plenty of red flags that you should be looking for. So first of all, I apologize for looking ridiculously pale. If you're watching on YouTube, I have no clue why I do. I've got all the curtains shut, so you're gonna just have to put up with it, I'm afraid. But first of all, Nick, welcome back.
Thank you. Happy to be back.
Great. And so, as I say, today we're talking about red flags when assessing a property for a glamping business. We speak to a lot of people on the phone who know that they want to start a glamping business. They like the return on investment it can offer. They like the change of lifestyle it offers, but they need to find a property. And sometimes the people that we speak to are a little bit naive as to some of the issues that you can come across when finding a property, beyond just finding a nice plot of land and negotiating a purchase or lease agreement. So we're going to cover those today. So we've identified 5 red flags to talk through, and I'm going to give Nick the floor for a lot of these because he is the real expert on it. But so we're going to talk about 5 red flags, and they are in this order: bad zoning, floodplains and wetlands, HOAs, easements, and infrastructure improvement requirements. So we're going to go through each of these now. So to kick us off, Nick, and this is going to link into what we were talking about in your first episode a while back, but the first red flag we're going to discuss is bad zoning when you're looking to buy a property for a glamping business. So Nick, do you want to just give us a quick recap of the zoning system? If anyone wants to have a longer recap, then they should go back and listen to your first episode, and we'll try to remember to put the link in the comments, in the description, sorry. But Nick, do you want to just quickly recap the zoning system and then what it means to have bad zoning when you're looking to buy a property for a glamping business?
Yeah, sure. So zoning is essentially power that is given to states, which is then given to counties and cities to regulate the way land is used. And it's originally done for the public health, safety, and welfare. That's the basis. It's supposed to be the basis of all zoning laws. Fast forward, over 100 years from when that started to today, and it's about a lot more than that. Really, it covers how you're able to use the property, as well as far as the actual use, what you're doing on the property, but then where you're able to do it on the property as well. So your setbacks, maximum height, how much you're allowed to have on the property, all of those kinds of things. And it's usually regulated by the county or city, whoever is the closest local government to you.
Mm-hmm. And so when someone's looking to buy a property for a glamping business, and let's say they get someone professional in to assess its suitability on the zoning side of things, what would it mean to you if you were to say, oh, it's got bad zoning or it's not got the right zoning for a glamping project?
Yeah, that's a good question that I think you phrase well. It's not that it's necessarily bad zoning, it's that it might be the wrong zoning or just not what's right for you or best for you. Zoning in and of itself isn't a bad thing. The land you're looking at might be zoned rural, it might be zoned conservation, it might be zoned industrial or residential. But at the end of the day, it's just saying this is what we, the local community, thinks should be here. That's not to say it's what has to be there, because you can change it. But in my mind, what makes it the wrong zoning is if you have to do a lot of work to get it changed or to get special approvals, either through a conditional use permit, special use permit, certain exceptions and variances, or an all-out rezoning, which changes your zoning from one zoning district to another zoning district. I think that's something that people aren't clear on, that use permits are not building permits. They just work with planning and what you're allowed to do on the property. Those don't change your zoning. Because you have a use permit, it doesn't mean you've gone from rural or agricultural zoning to something else. You still are in that same zoning district, but you have to get the special approval. Those special approvals I would call orange flags. what makes them a flag at all that isn't green is that it means you're most likely, especially in this market, going to have to close on the property without knowing with certainty that you have the right to do what you want to do on the property. So you're going to rely on an approval that they may or may not give you, and they certainly don't have to give you before you can do what you want. And I think that's what really raises the orange flag. I say orange instead of red for use permits because typically they're achievable. Now, certainly there are a lot of reasons why it might not be in a specific case, but they aren't automatically. Now, a full rezoning, which changes your zoning district from ag or rural or whatever it is to an entirely different one, is one of the hardest things to do when it comes to zoning, because that's not only going to allow you to do what you want to do, but it's going to allow every other use in that zoning district. So, for example, if glamping or a campground is only allowed in commercial zoning, and so you try to change to commercial zoning, well, the county or city or wherever you are is going to say, hey, if we say yes to that, we're also saying yes to convenience stores, gas stations, restaurants, banks, everything else in that commercial district. So that's what can make it really difficult. There are usually other zoning tools that you can change to where you are allowed to limit those other uses so that they're essentially just approving what you want. But those are also much more involved. The orange and red flags also correspond with the cost and time of doing these things. Use permits usually take less time than a full rezoning, but they take a long time. And use permits cost money, but they don't cost as much money as a full rezoning. And it's really just a matter of, do you want to go through all that headache, or do you want to find the property that doesn't require any of it?
Yeah, and I want to double down on the rezoning side of things as well, because let's say you're looking at a property and let's say it's in the residential district, which 9 times out of 10 wouldn't allow for a campground or whatever kind of use that you'd typically apply for a glamping project under. And some people I think can be a little bit naive and think, oh, we'll just get it rezoned, it's not a problem. But it's not. It's very rare. In fact, it's kind of illegal, right? If it's called spot zoning, where you say to the county, hey, I've got this small plot of land in the middle of a massive residential district. I want to change it to commercial zoning. The counties simply aren't allowed to just change one property just to help the property owner. It has to there has to be a reason for changing a particular lot zoning status, right?
Yeah, that's technically yes. Spot zoning is something that's not allowed in most places, and counties and cities will, and they do make that argument to deny zoning requests. But on the other hand, they won't approve a request unless you have a specific use. So you can't go to them and say, hey, I just really think this should be commercial. Here's why I think it makes a lot of sense. No, I don't have a project in mind. This just makes the most sense. That's the way it should really work to avoid spot zoning. But in practice, if you don't have a project, they're going to say no 99 out of 100 times. And so while they say you can't do spot zoning, you also have to have a specific reason to want to change it, which in effect is spot zoning. And so it's a tricky gray area, honestly. I think what you have to really do is look at your jurisdiction's specific approval criteria for rezoning. They'll usually have that listed out, line by line in the zoning ordinance, or at least in the application. And you need to address those, and you need to be able to legitimately fully address those and support your arguments for rezoning. Otherwise, you're doomed. It's going to be a no. It's much easier to say no, honestly, because if you're the jurisdiction and you deny a rezoning request, you might have one angry applicant. If you approve a request, you might have hundreds or thousands of angry citizens. And so, it's a high bar to get a rezoning approved typically. But that also is dependent on things like politics, economic development, and kind of which way the wind is blowing in your area. Sometimes in some communities, they're just starving for some kind of development and economic activity. And so they'll welcome something like glamping that is really a very low impact use, especially when done correctly or well. And so some places will welcome that, and they'll kind of, move mountains to help you get that stuff done. I'd say that's more rare than communities that don't want change.
And so obviously, I think we've gone pretty technical into zoning there. One thing I would say to to anyone who's looking to buy a property and needs to consider zoning is just to reach out to someone who does that kind of thing regularly, because it can get pretty technical. There's a whole load of issues to consider, as we've sort of just covered there. So that's the first red flag, and I promise everything after this is going to be slightly less technical. So do bear with us. The second red flag we're going to discuss is a little bit more straightforward. It's floodplains and wetlands. So Nick, do you want to just start off by defining what floodplains and wetlands are, and we can go into why they're a red flag in your eyes?
Yeah, sure. So really floodplains and wetlands. Floodplains are something that is actually defined by the government. There will be maps that indicate different flood zones, floodplains, flood hazard areas, flood awareness areas. There are several names, but those are items on a map that are identified. They may not in practice, when you go out there and look at the property, it might be a dry desert. But on this map, because of the calculations made by engineers as to what might happen in the case of a 100-year flood event, they think that area will be underwater. And that's essentially what a flood fill in the blank is an area that under some circumstances at some interval might flood and be underwater. There are other terms like wetlands and other things, which is really usually here used more as a description of what the actual current condition is on the property. And that the flood areas, zones, et cetera, are what's on the map. And what's on the map, ironically, has a lot more to do with with which ways you're limited than what is actually on the property. Because if it were underwater and the maps all said that it shouldn't be, you'd have a lot easier time than if it was completely dry, but all the maps said it should be underwater.
Yeah, and so when we're talking about floodplains and why they're an issue, we're not really saying, it's bad because your tents could be submerged. Obviously, that would be bad, but it's more of an issue when you're applying for permits, because there are quite often special provisions in county zoning codes pertaining to floodplain development. So, Nick, do you want to just talk us through what those typically are and why they are such a pain when it comes to developing in floodplain areas?
Yeah, exactly. So depending on the size of your project, what you might have to do would be either just raising your tent above the elevation that they think water could be at, which might be a few feet, it could be 6 feet, whatever it is. You just have to raise all structures really above that level. On a larger scale, for a bigger project, you might have to raise the ground level. And while really, honestly, usually neither of those is going to be a massive undertaking, the applications and approvals you have to go through for floodplain construction approval is lengthy. It requires engineering. It's extremely expensive. You got to get a lot of plans, studies. It's really that cost and time that goes into the approval processes it's usually your county that manages the floodplains on behalf essentially of the government, of the federal government. But really, it just takes so much time and effort. And at the end of the day, it's not guaranteed. So similar to some of the other zoning stuff, it's not guaranteed that you're going to get it approved. And so it's much, much easier to pass on a property, call it a red flag, and just move on and find something better than to try to go through that nightmare. Especially when you start combining these red flags, it gets to be a huge mountain to climb.
So how about if you've got a property and 50% of it is in a floodplain and 50% of it is outside of the floodplain? Does that change things at all?
Yeah, actually, completely. So if the floodplain is delineated on a map, and if you're outside of it, regardless of where your property lines are, once you're outside of that floodplain, you're outside of it. It's not going to apply anymore. There might be certain buffers, you might have a setback that you have to be at least 50 or 100 feet from that line. But once you get out of it, you're out of it. And so you're not going to have to go through those applications.
And so on to the next red flag, and this is less related to physical features of the land, and it's quite kind of related to how annoying people can be sometimes. But we're going to talk about HOAs or homeowners associations. So again, Nick, can you please explain what HOAs are and why they can be such a pain in the behind?
Yeah, sure. So they are a very unique organization in that they have actual powers over other people's private property. And but are in no way a government of any kind or have governmental powers of any kind, which on the one hand limits them in a few ways, but it also gives them significantly more power in a lot of ways, where governments are not allowed to limit certain things or address certain things. HOAs can, and they do. We've all heard nightmare stories of HOAs saying what kind of curtains you're allowed to have that face out to the street, and the fines that they can impose, which are very real, and they have legal authority to impose and collect on, and put liens against your property to collect for. At the end of the day, the reason they're really a red flag for me is because they have so much power, but no real regulation, and they're comprised of your neighbors. And so in the same way that neighbors opposing a project ever is a bad thing, having those neighbors oppose your project and have authority over what you can do on your property is another bad thing on top of that. And then you add in the rules and regulations of the HOA specifically that often do say you can't have commercial activities on your property, that limit access, that limit all sorts of things that you need to read through to understand just how much they already have set out that you can't do. And then beyond that, they can change the rules, sometimes without unanimous approval, which would of course have to include you if you're the owner. But sometimes they can just get a simple majority and pass new rules that after you have started make it impossible for you to continue. And for that reason, for me, really of all these red flags, an HOA is one that immediately is a complete deal breaker for me on a project.
And so I forgot to ask this in the previous red flag, actually. So how would you find out, A, if there's a floodplain on your property, and B, if your property belongs to an HOA?
Yeah, so for the floodplain, you can go to your county or city's websites and really just right off their main page, you can search floodplain management or your county's name, floodplain management. And that should get you to, if not PDF maps, an actual GIS interactive map. You type in your parcel number or address, and it'll show you the lines on the map. And if you have any difficulty doing that, you can always go to whichever agency, that's the county or the city, and ask them specifically, here's my property, I want to see it. When you buy the property, the title report that you receive ought to explain that. There should be something somewhere in there that says whether it is or is not in any kind of flood zone. And then it might take a little time to understand what the different flood zones mean. But again, you can talk to either the title company or the county and get a little bit more help on that. So that's the way to figure that out. And then an HOA, that's also something that'll come in your title report. There will be a fee almost certainly. And so that is disclosed when you purchase the property. If you're just doing research before purchasing the property, the HOAs are generally publicly recorded organizations, in the sense that if there's an HOA and there are CC&Rs or codes, covenants, and restrictions on your property, those have to get publicly recorded as well. And so you can search the property in your county's recorder office, and that'll tell you whether or not you have an HOA.
Hi everyone, thanks for listening. This is just a quick note to say that this podcast is brought to you by GlamProtects North America. And what we do is we help you through the process of starting a glamping business, no matter what stage you're at. So if you need to find a property, we'll tell you where the most suitable area is to start your glamping business. If you have a property, we'll look at your local zoning code and tell you how likely you are to get your project off the ground according to the zoning rules and regulations in your local area. We'll also give you a really good roadmap of permits that you'll need and regulations that you'll need to be aware of to get your glamping business off the ground. If you need financing, we'll introduce you to our range of financing partners and do you a feasibility study that will give you some really solid financial projections and market analysis that will allow you to acquire the funding that you need. If you need glamping units, we'll talk you through your options and introduce you to one of our trusted manufacturing partners to ensure that you're looked after throughout the whole process. If you need a site design, or if you need permits to move forward with your project, we've got architects who will do all your drawings, make all your arguments, and essentially allow your dream to become a reality. The list goes on, and I don't want to bore you, so I'll let you get back to the episode in a second. All I'd say is that GlamProtects North America are the people to speak to about starting a glamping business in the US or Canada. So if you're even thinking of starting a glamping business, just get in touch with us at contact@glamprotect.com or 646-586-2330. All the details are in the description, and no matter what stage of the process you're at, we will be able to help, whether it's doing something ourselves or pointing you in the right direction of our partners. Just let us know that you came from the podcast and we'll see about doing you a little discount along the way. So thanks for listening, and I'll let you get back to the episode. The next red flag is if there's any easements on the property. Now, obviously, there can be different types of easement with varying effects on the property's suitability for a glamping project. But could you just explain what an easement is, some typical examples, and then how they can affect a viability of a glamping project?
Yeah, sure. So I'll lean on a classic analogy or metaphor to explain this. But in property rights, it's often explained that your rights with your property is like a bundle of sticks. You have a lot of rights. It's not just this is my property and so I have the right to do what I want. There are a lot of different kinds of rights with your property, and an easement is essentially giving someone else a couple of those sticks, and they get to hold on to that based on the terms of the easement. Which sticks they are can vary widely. It could be an access easement, it could be an overhead electrical, it could be an easement essentially for someone to cross your property in the air. For say power lines, it can be an underground easement. It could be a utility easement for something that has nothing to do with electricity. It could be water. It could be an easement that gives your neighbor access to a well that might be on your property or on a different property, but it just cuts across. At the end of the day, it's giving somebody else some rights to your property. And the terms of an easement do also vary almost as widely as the number of types of easements do. So just because there's an easement doesn't necessarily mean it's a red flag. But for example, if someone has an access easement on a shared driveway, and the terms of that easement say that they have the right to X, Y, and Z, and that precludes you using it for a commercial purpose, big red flag, because your neighbor can just say, hey, I'm enforcing this and you have to stop, and they have the legal authority to do so. It's something that will get, if pushed, would get battled in the court system, but at the end of the day, they're in the right, so they have a better chance of winning that. With the legal system, it's not always about who's right or wrong as much as who's able to win, but they do have the law on their side, at least in making those arguments. So an easement giving someone else rights on your property, depending on what it is, can be a big problem. A lot of properties will have easements for different public utilities. Those I don't think are really a concern, usually because they run along the roads or where there's existing power lines or other utilities like that. And the government typically don't need to access those very often. They don't have requirements. If they've approved your use as a campground or whatever your use is being called, then they're not going to come and say, hey, we don't like that, you can't do it now because we've got a water pipe underground. It's typically more of a red flag when you have an easement and the beneficiary of that easement or the person who it's granted to is a private individual.
And are there ways to negotiate those? Like, would you, if for example, there's a shared driveway with your neighbor running through the property, and they have an ironclad right to use that and prohibit any commercial development, would you just say, no, I'm not even going to consider it, or would you approach them and see if there's any room to negotiate first?
For me, honestly, it's a red flag. It's a deal breaker to me. If there's shared access, I just move on, and I would recommend anybody else do the same. And the reason for that is that while you can go, and they might be the greatest people in the world, they might love your project. They might genuinely love it, even after you've built it out, even after you have guests coming and going, they may love it and you. But what happens when they sell that property? The next person that comes in, which you have no control over, may not feel the same way, and they can make life really hard for you and your guests. And it's just a kind of a sticky situation that it's hard to get out of once you're in it. Now, there is an exception. Now, you could go to your neighbor and you could change the agreement. You could record deed restrictions, which essentially they run with the land, so it doesn't matter if the person sells it, that outlines some ability for you to do what you want to do. The reality, though, is what neighbor is ever going to agree to that? Because it's essentially now them giving you a couple of their sticks of property rights. And what motivation do they have? Sometimes it's because you paid them. Sometimes it's because you've given them some corner of land that they always wanted from your property. So there are things you can negotiate, but I find that getting a win there is so rare that it's not worth the time and hassle when there's a better deal around the corner.
Fantastic. And the final red flag we're going to discuss is where if you're looking to buy property and you need to undergo significant infrastructural improvements. So why is that a red flag?
That's a big red flag for me, because typically offsite improvements, well, I guess first let me explain what that means. An offsite improvement is something that is not on your property that you have to construct, build, repair, or modify in some way, which essentially usually means that it's in the public space. So that could be paving a road, taking a road from dirt to gravel. It could mean extending a sewer line some distance, power, water. Those are the typical offsite improvements that are required. But it could be something like you have to fix a drainage problem that is not even on your property because your development will in some way impact that. Those, because they're in that public domain, are often larger and they're often very, very expensive. Somebody I'm working with right now just got comments back that they have to pave access to the nearest paved road, which is like 2 miles, and is going to cost, definitely high six figures, if not more. And so we have to try to get a waiver to avoid that and make our arguments. But at the end of the day, that would be a deal breaker, having to pave a road that far. In some places, it's just a matter of bringing in a sewer line 500 feet. That's terribly expensive. You're going to have to potentially rip up the existing roadway. There's all sorts of regulations and extra measures that whoever's doing that construction has to take for traffic, for safety, for notice, and all these things. And so those offsite improvements add up very fast and add, six figures plus easily to any project. And so understanding what those are up front is really, really important. And they can be difficult to discover.
And how, that was going to be my next question, how do you discover that whether those improvements are needed?
Yeah, the best way to start is by submitting for a pre-application meeting. It's called different things in different places, sometimes concept review or whatever the name is, but it's essentially a meeting before a formal application is submitted where you tell them what you want to do. It gets submitted out to the different departments and they give some kind of preliminary comments. Often those are boilerplate, and, they'll literally be copied and pasted, but it's good to see what they are because then you get an idea for, what's going to be asked for. Now, what's tricky is if you don't know what they're allowed to ask for and what they're not, or what they're not allowed to require, those first comments could seem overwhelming and you say no, when in reality, like in the case I gave, you can request, you can appeal that requirement to pave the road, get granted a waiver, and now you just saved yourself, $800,000. But they're not going to offer usually that you can appeal that. It's something that you have to find out yourself, or like you said, by hiring somebody with experience.
Mm-hmm. And so we've discussed five different red flags there. We've discussed zoning, floodplains, HOAs, easements, and offsite infrastructure improvements. How would you rank those? Is there one or two that stick out as particularly red, that you would just say, look, if this is present in a property that I'm looking at for a glamping project, I'm just going to walk away straight away? Are there any that really stick out to be like that bad?
Yeah, I would say number one is HOA, which includes a roadway association. So sometimes there's a homeowners association, and sometimes it's just a roadway association or a roadway management agreement where it's all the same thing, but it's all limited to just the roadway. Even with that, I'm out. It's a deal breaker for me. That's the number one thing is HOAs and roadway associations. So that's number one. Number two, I guess HOAs fall into that, but number two would be the floodplains and wetlands. It's just often such a nightmare. If what you want to develop is within that space, it's probably not worth it. Easements, if they're something that impacts the way you use it, is another one. And I would probably put bad zoning last. Offsite infrastructure. Actually, offsite infrastructure I would push up to number two. So I would go HOAs, offsite infrastructure, floodplains and wetlands, easements, and then bad zoning. But bad zoning might move higher up for folks. This is what I do for a living, so it may not be as intimidating, but having to change zoning or getting big approvals could be more difficult for the lay person. But what I will say about all these red flags to qualify them is that they're red flags because they're really big obstacles. But if you can get over an obstacle, everybody chasing you has to jump it too. And they may not be able to either afford it or have the energy or the time or whatever was special to you that got you over that obstacle. It's a big hurdle for your competition to get in. And so if it's something that applies largely in the area you're in, it might be a chance for you to get a competitive edge and be the only glamping operation in the area. So while I typically will just move on, if you can't or don't want to, or it's just too good of a property to pass up, maybe it's worth it.
Okay, and we focus on the negatives so far. Think bad things to look out for when purchasing a property. Before we finish off, we probably should be a little bit more optimistic and think about some green flags that you should be looking for. What makes an ideal location for a glamping project. So just quickly, have you got any green flags that people should be looking for when finding a property for a glamping business?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first one is really, I mean, I guess the opposite of all of the red flags. So no HOA, no floodplains. Once you do account for all of those, another really good one is just having no zoning at all. Believe it or not, there's a lot of places in the country where there is no zoning whatsoever, and there are even actually some places that still don't even have building permit requirements. And so if you search hard enough, you can find some of those, and then it's really truly unrestricted land, and you've got a clear path ahead of you. All you have to do is build it for the most part. A big one is no visible neighbors. So it's one thing to not be in an HOA. It's another thing to not have your neighbors even be able to see or hear what's going on your property. So if you're in the fortunate position of being able to get a property that is that far away from other homes, or it's so big and you can focus things in the center that you're kind of hidden, that is a major green flag. Another one is having direct access to a road, so you don't have to cross over anybody else's property. You don't have to, go through a shared drive, and that the road you get to is managed and maintained by the local government. That's pretty huge because it means that it's going to be an all-weather road, and it's going to mean that you don't have to do those off-site infrastructure improvements, at least as far as roadways go. I really love, even though I said I don't like floodplains, I really love water features. I think that's a massive green flag. If it's a pond, a stream, a creek, rivers get a little tricky because that usually brings in flood, but those other water features are huge. And then relatively flat. Slopes are really a tough thing to work with, but if it can be relatively flat, that's huge.
Great. Well, Nick, thanks again. If anyone's got any questions about red flags, green flags, and anything in between, how do they get in touch and ask you?
You can reach me at nick@zoningeverything.com or at zoningeverything on socials.
Fantastic. Well, Nick, thanks again for being our first repeat guest since the US rebrand. I'm sure we'll have you on to get a hat trick at some point.
Awesome.
But thanks again, and hopefully people can get in touch and ask you any questions they've got from today's episode.
Perfect. Thanks for having me.